Now I'd like to introduce Mary Jo Bain, the chair of Pine Street's Board of Directors and the academic dean at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Mary Jo.
I'm also a resident of the Savin Hill neighborhood in Boston, which seems to be a theme here at the breakfast today, and I am delighted to do that. As Artie said, I am the chair of the board at the Pine Street Inn, a great honor to be sure, and I am here on behalf of the board to welcome my friend and colleague, David Gergen. David is a public service professor at the Kennedy School of Government, where he is an enormously popular teacher, making the rest of us look shameful, and also the director of the Center for Public Leadership, which is one of our major research centers. I first met David in the White House when he was an advisor to President Bill Clinton, and I was working in the Department of Health and Human Services. David's job with me was to try to advise me how to avoid committing astonishingly bad political blunders as we pursued our agenda. He takes no responsibility for what I did. He has been, as you know, an advisor not only to Democratic presidents, but also to Republican presidents, and he is, of course, a best-selling author, the most recent book being Eyewitness to Power. So please join me in welcoming David Gergen.
Now, I must tell you, it was back in the late 60s, while I was in law school here, I had the opportunity in our third year, we had to write a paper. You know, it was supposed to be somewhat academic. I've always tried to avoid being too academic. But I chose to write a paper and went out and walked the streets of Roxbury for a good long time that third year to write our paper about public housing and the promises and challenges faced by public housing. And it was an extremely interesting time, a time when the government was in full support of trying to do more for people who lacked shelter, for people who did not have affordable housing. And there was a great sense of promise in the air that we could really overcome the gaps, the inequities that we faced as a people. And I must say, in the years since, there has been a sense of retreat on the part of government, on the part of organized public life in Washington toward those who are at the lower end. And our politics is more and more about the middle class and about the upper class. Ernie Cortez, an organizer and a friend out of the Southwest Industrial Organization out of Texas and California, he organizes a lot of Hispanics, told me not long ago, he said, you know, the Republican Party seems to mostly care about people who make $200,000 a year or more, and the Democratic Party seems to care mostly about people who make $100,000 a year or more, and very few people worry about anybody who makes less than 40. And I think that has been true of our politics now for a while. Even now, all of us know that we're in the midst of a housing crisis with a subprime issue. But almost all of the conversation has been about, and this is a very real concern, it's a legitimate concern, but it's almost all of the conversation is about people who own homes, who are in the middle class, who are losing their homes. Very little of the conversation has been about the cascading problems, that problems are cascading downward for those who do not own homes and are homeless or need affordable housing. And those needs are going to grow. There's a real disconnect and a tension even between people who work in the area of affordable housing and those who now govern us. Yesterday morning, I spoke to the National Convention of officials who work on public housing around the country. They run both state and local agencies around the country. They were in Washington, D.C. And I spoke to them at breakfast yesterday morning and announced that the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Mr. Jackson, was going to resign that morning. They broke out in thunderous applause. It was really quite a surprise to me just how much a gap there was between the people who were working out on the front lines on affordable housing and public housing and those who were leading these national agencies, which are supposed to be in alliance with them. So we've got some issues here, and even when you look at the candidates, we've had some very interesting proposals put on the table by the three presidential candidates. But is there an urban policy that you found in the midst of this conversation so far? I think one could look long and hard and not really see very much there that you would call a serious urban policy. So I must tell you that as we gather this morning, I think that the larger message I'd like to start with and leave you with is no matter what happens in our national politics, there's going to be the fate of people who in Boston who are homeless, who can't find affordable housing, is going to continue to rest primarily in the hands of people who live here. That all of us who live in our communities have our own responsibilities, that to look to Washington to solve this even after this election is over, I think is a misplaced sense of hope. That it's really more important to say, we're going to continue to shoulder this responsibility together. This is our community. We care about this community. We care about the people who live here. And Pine Street Inn represents one of the very best, the most effective means we have found for addressing these issues. One of the things that Mary Jo and I see is that there is a lot of help on the way coming from the younger generation. One of the great things that's happening in the country now is that we have a new generation coming up in their 20s and 30s who are deeply idealistic. They're deeply committed to social change. They don't particularly like politics. They don't particularly like to go into government, unfortunately. But they do deeply care about the civic sector and social change. Some of them are going into standard nonprofits. Some of them are becoming what they call social entrepreneurs. The label doesn't matter. What matters is that how many of these young people want to be out there and make a difference and work in groups like this to help you as you move forward, to help in so many other areas. Boston is a laboratory, one of the nation's best laboratories for these students who want to be involved in social change. You look at the kind of groups that have started here, whether it's City Year or Jumpstart or College Summit, all these other things that have been moving around here. And there are some wonderful organizations, and people are lining up among the young. They're not just going out and voting this time around. They're lining up. 6 years ago, among Harvard seniors, about 34 signed up, volunteered to join Teach for America, to go out and teach for 2 years in the urban schools, toughest urban schools, about 34 6 years ago. We've just closed the books on the volunteers for this year's senior class. I happen to be on the board for Teach for America. In this year's senior class, some 340 volunteered. 12% of the graduating class at Harvard is volunteering to go out on the streets and work for social change. Those are impressive numbers. This last spring, we're waiting to get the final numbers from Wendy Kopp. This last spring, between 5 and 10% of the graduating classes volunteered for Teach for America on 90 different campuses around the country. 90 different campuses. And Wendy told me the other day that the application rates for this year are up sharply from last year. Guess what? There are not enough spots in Teach for America to take all those kids. Those kids are still committed. They still want to participate. We have other issues like homelessness, affordable housing, health care. There are so many different of these organizations that we ought to be encouraging, sponsoring, because there is this gap between what government we once thought government would do and what's in reality happening. And so many of our citizens are being caught in that gap. And these young people are ready, willing, and able to serve, and we need to tap into that energy, encourage them to step forward. It's happening all over the world. Nicholas Kristof in the New York Times told me recently, he said he goes all these places like Rwanda and Sudan and tough places. He goes all over the world looking at things. He said in country after country, it's not the older generation that is setting the standards and stepping forward to lead. It's the younger generation that's stepping up to it. So that's the good news. There is a lot out there. And for those of us in the older generation, as we see these problems and realize, we haven't realized the promises that we thought we made to each other some years ago back in the 60s. It's really important that we not only stay engaged with the Pine Street Inn, but also to encourage these young people to come and help and be part of the solution. And if we do that, I think you can see a real push that won't come from Washington, but a mobilization at the local level that would make a significant difference. Thank you very much.